Welcome to A Slice of SEL, a podcast for educators about social emotional learning.
Welcome to A Slice of SEL. We're the SEL services team at the St. Croix River Education District. I'm Nick.
I'm Angela.
And I'm Kevin.
And today we're focusing on values. Values like respect, integrity, honesty, loyalty, responsibility, determination. Where do values fit in schools? How do we help students to identify and live by their values?
But before that, let's talk about what's filling our buckets this week. I'll start. Spring has sprung. Definitely. I'm looking forward to this nice weather that we're having. And it's that time of year at schools where we start to plan for next year. I'm just really passionate and excited about the opportunity to help teams plan and improve their behavior programming for next year. So I've been called into a couple of teams already to start that planning, and I just get really pumped up for the next school year.
That's really exciting. What's filling my bucket is I very recently finished spring break, and I think that's enough said right there. But my birthday was over spring break, and we got carrot cake, bundt cake, and highly recommend that. And that also filled my bucket.
Well, I'm happy for you both because you've already had your spring break, but the spring break for our northern member districts is next week. So right now, thinking of next week is filling my bucket because there's a lot of things right now that's draining. It's all the constant meetings and everyone trying to squeeze everything in right now. So I'm holding on for next week.
Keep holding on, Kevin. It's close.
Hang in there.
We're going to shift to our main topic of values. So, Angela, a handful of years ago, you and I were both at a restorative practices training. And during that, one thing I did was circle up with a bunch of other educators, and we went around talking about what values we'd picked up during our upbringings. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Like on the paper plates?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, thinking back, that was probably the first time I'd really heard values named as a thing during my educational career. Mm-hmm. But thinking back to those examples of values I gave in our intro, respect, integrity, honesty, loyalty, responsibility, determination, I know that every school in our member districts has 3 to 5 school-wide shared behavior expectations, and those frame all of their rules, those 3 to 5 values. And those 3 to 5 behavior expectations are values. I mean, everybody listening probably recognized their 3 to 5 school-wide behavior expectations in that list I gave. Those are values. So for example, Chisago Lakes Middle School, their school-wide expectations are respect, responsibility, compassion, commitment, and integrity. All of their specific rules are framed and communicated around those 5 core values that they have as a school.
Yeah, Nick, those are good examples of how our schools have collective values. And I know that's not our real focus today, but I think it's good that we're bringing up some of those examples of how values are already part of our work as educators. Just one more example of that. I mean, I've worked for several school districts, and I can't think of a district I've seen that hasn't identified those collective values.
Absolutely. You know, like at SCRED, our organizational values are collaboration, innovation, and advocacy. And like you said, Kevin, like pretty much every district, I work with 6 of them. Every one of them has kind of those core values identified for them as an organization. But even just beyond schools, so many organizations and companies is what I mean there. So many companies do the same thing in the private sector. So like I've watched my fair share of Hard Knocks, for example, where HBO covers NFL teams behind the scenes during training camp. And every year you're going to see NFL team leaders talking explicitly about their values as a collective group. So like Kevin said, we're not going to spend the episode focusing on those collective values. You can check out previous episodes about rules and pre-correction prompts in our podcast for more discussion about those collective values. We want to spend the rest of our time today talking about the wider scope of values that individual students might identify as important to themselves as individuals, or that they might identify in other people, like their role models, for example.
Right. And Nick, just to give a few concrete examples right away, what we mean by this is maybe on an ELA worksheet Or during a discussion in class, you could be asking students, what does this choice that the character made tell you about their values? Or maybe pick a value that would help this character in the situation and explain how. Or in a social studies class, you could do the same thing with historical figures, like, what do you think were the values driving Abraham Lincoln's decision? Or what does that decision tell you about Frederick Douglass's values? Or even if you could pick one value that would help Harry Truman in this situation, what would it be and why?
Awesome examples, Angela. Those are examples of how this discussion should be embedded into content throughout the day. So I'm just going to kind of give a comparison. So that example that we gave at the very beginning of the episode, like a couple of years ago, you and I were in this training where we're actually circling up with other adults. We're outright sharing our values with each other. Like, this is a value that I have, and just stating it out loud. So that's a format and a level of explicitness that I just know isn't going to resonate with all the teachers out there listening to this podcast. And we get that. Like, we're all not you can't assume that everybody's comfortable with like, oh yeah, let's just circle up as a class and just like go around and share our values with each other. So that's a different thing than the examples that you just gave. Like, the examples you just gave were in ELA, in social studies, with the content you're going over, embedding little nuggets of examining the values and thinking about values during that content that's already there. And those things are really different. Like, there are lessons and activities in our Be Good People curriculum that do help people guide students to identify and communicate their values. And I do think that's important. We're not saying this is like one or the other, right? But even if you do that dedicated activity stuff, it doesn't have to be in a whole group circle, like partner discussions, writing or journaling prompts, pulling up digital cards of values. Like, there's different formats that we use in Be Good People to guide those conversations that offer different degrees of privacy to students. So it's not so uncomfortable for the educators guiding and facilitating that.
Right.
But yeah, just setting all of that aside, like, let's set aside that stuff about like dedicated activities where we're like, it's obvious that we're pausing to talk about values. Setting that aside for a moment, the kind of examples that you gave, Angela, a minute ago in ELA and social studies class, that's that day-to-day integration that we know really, really matters.
Absolutely. And I'm just going to summarize what we've covered for a second. So number one, we talked about those collective values in schools, which for students are those common behavior expectations that we frame school rules around. For example, respectful, responsible, and ready to learn. That should be a part of our common language every day. So students should hear about those literally every day in our prompting and in our praise, but they aren't personal to each student. And it's a list of maybe 3 to 5 values. So it's not comprehensive. So beyond that, number 2, we have those direct conversations with students where we're asking questions like, what are your values? Where did they come from? How do you know those are your values? And there's a different discussion or writing formats for students to reflect on those questions, but the point stands. It's that dedicated time that often is falling during advisory or morning meetings or class connect time in our schools. But number 3, that's the main focus of this episode. That integrated, embedded talking about values as they occur in the curriculum content students are learning about every single day.
Right. And thank you for that summary, Kevin. I'm sure we've been bouncing around a little bit. I'm sure the listeners appreciate that. So 1, 2, 3, 3 kind of separate ways that values are happening in our schools. And if I were listening to the podcast right now, I think I would be thinking, okay, say that I'm up for asking those questions that Angela gave as examples, you know, talking about characters in literature or the historical figures that we're learning about and asking what values they're showing or what values would be good to guide the decisions that they're making. Where do I get the options for students to pick from? Because students aren't necessarily going to have that vocabulary of a laundry list of values to pick from in their brain, right? That's a really important piece of this, I think, because you don't want to be asking them a question like that and then just crickets, because kids just don't know where to pull from to give you an answer. So guys, in the show notes of the episode, what we are going to do is link in an activity from the Be Good People curriculum. And the reason we're doing that is in that activity, there's this digital card deck where we took about 60 common values like respect, responsibility, and just made a little digital card of each one with a little definition. And I think I could see people just copying and pasting that link into a presentation shared with their students so that the students can just access it directly. So if you're sharing like a PowerPoint with kids about a historical figure, you could like throw a link in there to that values deck, literally the same one that we made that we're sharing with you, just so students can pull it up and like shuffle through it and pick something as an answer. Like that's one possible way that you could use it. I can see teachers just copying and pasting from that like list of values into a worksheet, maybe some of the definitions that we offered as well. I mean, the formats are going to vary. And by the way, I'm really curious to see what pedagogical adaptations people make with that content, the raw content we're sharing with them, just like lists of values and some definitions. So the format is going to vary, but the point is that, yeah, it's probably not enough to just ask the questions without giving students some examples. Like we know how that works. Students aren't going to make as thoughtful of a choice. They're probably going to go with what they can remember. Like maybe one or two students will throw a word out there, like maybe respect. And other students, maybe you're just going to parrot that because they're not sure what to say otherwise. And it won't be a value that really means something to them. It'll just be low-hanging fruit that somebody else just said. So I think it is really helpful to give students some examples to pick from.
Yeah, absolutely, Nick. So helpful. I can think just off the top of my head of just a few different teachers at CLHS, actually, that would really be able to take and run with that list. And it would be really helpful for their learning, especially in the English classrooms and social studies classrooms, like we already mentioned. So now just a few things before we wrap up for today. One is that we think it's important to talk about how value is related to our 5 SEL competencies in Minnesota. So self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. Those first two, self-awareness and self-management, can be boiled way down to who am I and what do I do about it. The second two, social awareness and relationship skills, can be boiled way down to who are these people and how do I relate to them. And then the last one is overarching. How do I take into account all this information about myself and other people and make a good choice about it?
Thanks, Angela. So often the first thing people think about with SEL is emotions, and we talk about those plenty. So when it comes to emotions, it's for self-awareness, what emotions do I feel? For self-management, it's what do I do about the emotions that I'm feeling? For social awareness, it's what emotions do these other people feel? Empathy. For relationship skills, how do I respond to these other people's emotions, like the emotions of my parents or my friends? And when it comes to ELA and social studies and those reflection questions, we talk about emotions a lot. Like, how would you feel if you were in this situation that the character in the novel is in? Or how do you think this character's emotions are influencing their choices right now? How do you think General Grant was feeling when he received that message from his scouts? How do you think that this might have influenced his next move in the battle? But the point that we're trying to make here is that you can take everything I just said and replace emotions with values. So even though, like I said, emotions have that kind of priority and it's the first thing people think of with social emotional learning, like values are very similar. They're two things that everybody has. Everybody has emotions and emotional life going on inside. And every person, including ourselves, we have some values. So I'll just say that one more time. Emotions and values are two things that everybody has. So that means that I have them. That means that everybody around me has them. That means that they influence my decisions and they influence other people's decisions. And anything that fits that bill, emotions, values, beliefs, those are the core pieces of SEL, really. They're the core of life skills, of soft skills, of whatever you want to call it. So back to those 5 SEL standards in Minnesota, self-awareness and self-management, those two, they're really asking, like, what are my values, and how do they influence my behavior? For social awareness and relationship skills, like the main boiled down question is, what are these other people's values? What are my friends' values, my parents' values, my teacher values, and how are they influencing their behavior? So emotions and values, very parallel is what I was trying to get across there.
Yeah, Nick, such important questions. As adults, we know that when we have to make difficult decisions, our values are a big part of that. When we're disagreeing with other people about something, one of the ways we can find common ground is bringing it back to the values behind our actions. As a parent, I know the values I want my daughter to grow up with and internalize to be her guide. And Nick, before we wrap up, I just want to share this quote from Martin Luther King Jr. "We must remember that intelligence is not enough. Intelligence plus character. That is the goal of true education." I think that ties us up nicely because we got into this education business because we want the next generations to be equipped with a love of learning and the skills to run our society, but also to live by positive values like honesty, compassion, respect, and integrity.
Absolutely, Kevin. Hard agree with all of that. And just to talk takeaways quick, we hope that you leave this episode with more intention around values, and you're going to look at your academic curriculum content with that intentional lens and maybe see more opportunities to discuss values with students during academic instruction, that embedded piece. So asking questions like, what is this choice that the character made tell you about their values? Or if you could pick one value that would help Harry Truman in this situation, what would it be and why? And again, we're going to link into the show notes a tool, just one tool that you could use to give your students some examples of values so that we can scaffold that vocabulary.
Thanks for spending time with us today. Make sure to subscribe. And if you're on YouTube, click the bell so that you're notified when new episodes are released. We'll see you when you come back for another Slice of SEL.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.